Hello and welcome back to this Downplay Duelist Crusade. This video is my final reaction and takeaway from No Time to Die, the latest Eon released official James Bond film, which of course there was so much to process. It definitely took some time to get my final feelings together, and of course I wanted to give other people time to actually see the film and process it for themselves due to the staggered release. We didn't get it here in the States for a little while. I did see it opening release day, and then I know many people have had to go see it multiple times and discuss with other fans in and out of Bond forums and other places. It's a heck of a lot to digest, especially for Bond fans, and it's still a film that I don't really know. The overall acceptance factor has been much higher than I anticipated, but you can definitely tell there is some pushback, and this video will definitely be among those, because now that I've finally had time to process the film and what it was trying to do and my own particular feelings on it, I would like to once again quote the same quote that I did in my initial reactions video, which is a bit snarky, but it is when Richard Maybaum was talking about a previous film that he had made with director Terrence Young back in the 1950s, a film actually called No Time to Die, that didn't turn out very well, and he of course said in the From Russia with Love Criterion audio commentary on the CAV Special Edition Laserdisc release, something to the effect of, and I do quote, we made a picture called No Time to Die, and when I saw it, it felt like it was time to die, and that is my reaction to the current 2021 No Time to Die, the official James Bond release from Eon, which seems entirely devised to be an anti-Bond film, to try and completely go against the grain of the James Bond formula that had been established by Dr. No in 1962 and formalized by From Russia with Love in 1963 and cemented by Goldfinger in 1964. The Bond formula is a hindrance in some ways creatively, yes, but it's a hurdle you have to get over and work with in order to make a proper James Bond film. It's really just about the hardest job there is, because no other series has this level of longevity and legacy. And by completely throwing away said legacy and going completely off the charts into unknown territory and just going two sheets to the wind is not the approach to take. And that's what Eon has seemingly been after all these years. And they have not really had a game plan, particularly with the modern Craig era after the essential rebooting of the 2006 Casino Royale, which was, at the very least, did have some of the requisite energy of a James Bond film, which is one of the key critical factors to any Bond film being successful, is having the energy that was set in terms of tone in the Terrence Young days and by Peter Hunt's rapid-fire editing, which is something the series has struggled with ever since Peter Hunt left after On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969. But outside of that and Martin Campbell's direction, that at least had somewhere to go, which I will give it, even though, as most people well know, I can't stand any of the modern Craig era. But after that point, they've really been just going two sheets to the wind and seemingly doing whatever felt right at the time. And No Time to Die is the greatest example of this. And for all of its pulls from original Fleming material that I was very surprised to see, it doesn't really add up to anything other than completely stepping away from the Bond formula. And my hope, and I guess this is the takeaway in terms of my hopes for the future, is that Eon has now gotten this out of their system. They've done their experimental phase, they've gotten it out of the way, and to continue down that path would be to become something else entirely, which is what they've been moving towards, and continuing to alienate further parts of the core Bond fandom and general fans as well, who go in expecting a James Bond film and come out with absolute downbeat faces, not knowing what they'd sat through, and not in a good way, not in the manner of which people came out of On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969. That was a downbeat ending, yes, but it was justified and earned and worked within the context of the story, and that gave it even more dramatic weight, and it was built up to over the course of the film, which No Time to Die continually tries to harken back to and reference and hit you over the head that it wants to be like On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because according to the internet, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is possibly the best James Bond film now, and whatever the internet says must be true. It's not from a genuine place of we want to reference OHMSS because it's this important to us. For decades, especially when Cubby Broccoli was still at the helm, OHMSS was the film that nobody liked to talk about because it was deemed a failure, and everything was designed to get around the black sheep of the series. And it's only been really in the past 15, 20 years that there's been the critical reappraisal again due to the internet, which something similar to a lesser degree has happened with License to Kill, which is good to see at least. But for all of No Time to Die's OHMSS references, really what it's pulling from in terms of Fleming text is surprisingly the You Only Live Twice novel, which I when that started to come up at the very end of the pre-title sequence, that especially when it's a dead giveaway when Bond stupidly just decides to cut off his relationship and puts Madeline on the train, and she kind of has that look, and you see the hands go across her belly, and I'm like, oh, that's where we're going now. But at least that sparked my interest for a moment. I must admit, it was the first of the riffs and references and nods to the past, whether it be the films or the original Fleming text, that actually got my attention, because this would be new uncharted territory that was not outside of Fleming. What I feel the Craig era has missed in its experimentation, this was the perfect opportunity to actually do elements of Fleming text that were not really part and parcel of the Bond series. The Bond series, in terms of the films, the cinematic Bond has always been much more about the purity of the escapism factor by having the larger-than-life and the serious grounded stories, usually at least with some sprinkling of Fleming in there, but never with the intensive focus on grittiness and the deeper human condition of Bond himself as a character, all of his fears, his anxieties, and his internal monologue and things. You get that in the films inherently, but they are much more about Bond's cavalier approach to things and introducing the dry, sardonic humor, which is in Fleming. I get tired of people saying Fleming wasn't humorous. He's hysterically funny when he wanted to be, but that extra point to the wit is something that Terence Young and Richard Maybaum and others developed at the very start of things, knowing that was required for the cinematic lexicon to give Bond a little bit more of the edge of the lady killer figure and work that into the cinematic characterization. So you have to understand that in making a Bond film, you have the book Bond world and you have the cinematic Bond world or the film Bond world. And the best films are able to blend those successfully and not feel like they're straying too far out of either place. So seeing No Time to Die was already starting to pull from unused Fleming material. I first thought, okay, well, Purvis and Wade worked on this script, and that's what they like to do, is pull unused Fleming bits out and actually work them into films, which I do applaud, but most of the time other writers come in or those stories don't get developed enough, and then you have interesting bits in stories that completely fall apart, such as The World's Not Enough, or Once I Realized Die Another Day essentially is pulling bits out of Fleming's The Man with the Golden Gun and working it into the unused Moonraker novel plot. Great idea, just never really worked in the execution of it for various reasons. The same thing happens here, but on the grandest scale ever to befall the Bond series. And so ultimately, in spite of those things causing interest and all of the things that are so atypical of the Bond formula outside of Bond having a child and a serious relationship and the thoughts perhaps of having a normal mundane life, which does occur at least in passing and fleeting thoughts in OHMSS in both novel and film, those are so alien to the cinematic Bond identity that it's a very fine balancing act, a very fine line you have to walk in order to make that work. And all this stuff is just thrown out there in No Time to Die. It is not established. There's no belief in the Bond and Madeline relationship. That was not set up properly in Spectre either. And we are just essentially led around by the hand, or I should say the audience is led around by the hand from one thing to another with very little connection between. And you also get the feeling of It's connecting the dots, trying to tick off all the check boxes of all the things that are unanswered questions or unanswered plot points from the previous Craig films. That, again, this notion they had of making the films one continuous story and eventually using it to re-inject the Spectre organization and Ernst Stavro Blofeld into proceedings as once they got the rights from the McClory estate. It just doesn't work. They never made it work. They never planned this stuff out, and No Time to Die. Thus, in a lot of ways, I was very reminded of seeing Rise of Skywalker, which had similar problems, and it very much that is the closest film experience I think to No Time to Die, because I found myself sitting in the theater and just reflecting on what I'm seeing while I'm watching it, which is the ultimate sign of the movie is not working when you're sitting there counting the references without even trying to, and you're trying to figure out where they're going with this as they're going along, and eventually you find you just want it to be over, which is really how I felt throughout the entirety of the thing. And my personal relief is the fact that now this era is over, and perhaps we can now move forward now that this experimentation has gotten out of their system. But I will admit that I did something that I've never actually quite done before. As I'm sitting in No Time to Die, I saw it the morning of opening release day here in the U.S. So it's been a little over a month since I first saw it. I was sitting there in the theater, and once the Fleming bits started coming in, and I noticed how disjointed the plot was and how it had most of the same problems that the previous film Spectre did, and it didn't really do anything to address those issues. I found myself starting to literally rewrite the film in my head as it went along, and I've continued to do that on and off in the month or so since. So, in the second part of this video, I would just want to go through my basic spitballing of how, if I was presented with the same scenario, if I had to go and make No Time to Die myself, how I would have approached some of the same material. I do think that with a few little changes, I think it could have been a better send-off and a more Bondian flavor and feel, which is what it so sorely was lacking in and so sorely required. It also brings up the notion that this doesn't really feel like a send-off for the Daniel Craig era at all. It doesn't even feel connected to it. It just feels... I hate to use the term as a negative because I have read good things written by fans, but honestly, No Time to Die feels like bad fan fiction in the worst possible sense. Things happen, things are written off, characters are brought in simply to be written off without feeling, without a proper setup. Thus, their deaths feel like a waste of the character. For example, Felix Leiter, Blofeld, the entirety of the Spectre organization is simply written off. We literally see everyone just die in one scene. And I don't mind killing off a bunch of characters, but I mean, yes, the title is No Time to Die, and of course, in my own personal fiction, I have a penchant for always killing off characters. But you know, if there's no reason for it, if it's not directly tied into things, and it's just there, and the entire audience feels like it's a total waste, why did we invest any time in this? Because now you're just going to kill these characters off. Well, then it becomes a joke, and there's no point, and there's no resonance in any of the deaths. And then on top of that, you decide to kill James Bond himself. And not in a self-sacrificing manner, but in a manner that literally is staged and designed to make it as if, oh, James Bond realizes he can't have a happy family life, which he would hate anyway, as Fleming wrote many times. And so because of this, he just decides to, allow himself to be eliminated by the missile strike, which also is another one of the many issues with the film. M calls in a missile strike on foreign territory and apparently just gets away with it without, raising the ire of the rest of the world with zero explanation. But again, the staging of the sequence, James Bond literally gives up, which is something James Bond would never do in any circumstance, and just literally allows himself to be eliminated. You could, of course, make the argument that he does this because he doesn't want there to be any chance of the DNA virus that kills bloodlines to be able to get out and destroy his, would-be family. guess I could understand that, but it's not as if this is established. It's just literally him standing there and having the Terry final radio call as if it was an outtake from Armageddon when Bruce Willis sacrifices himself. But again, that was actually built up to. I'm actually praising Michael Bay for once in my life. Go figure. But it just that stuck in my cross so horribly. I don't even mind the fact that they killed the Bond character off, which is something that you should never do in these films, because by that point I was so bruised and battered by the experience that has been killing me since 2006, since this new era started of literally just throwing out the legacy of the film series and the character along with it, that I was just ready for it to be over, and I was hoping that this meant the entirety of the Craig era would then thus be its own particular block that is its own universe, as if this was now Bond moving into more of the territory of shared comic book universes, where you have different versions of characters and on different worlds that have their own storylines. They don't really interact with each other, but if you choose to enjoy that for that particular run, you may do so. And I'm thinking that's where they're now going with this, but I don't believe any of this was pre-planned. Again, it all definitely has the feel of being made up as it goes along. But the final nail in the coffin for me was the usage of "We Have All the Time in the World" as the actual fade out end song credits. Not only had they quoted the theme and pieces of John Barry's OHMSS score throughout Hans Zimmer's otherwise completely forgettable underscoring, but to actually use the original Louis Armstrong recording from Under Majesty's Secret Service from 1969 felt so completely insulting and out of place and wrong for that instance. And of course, being played out over the cutesy inversion of the ending of Under Majesty's Secret Service, right down to the fact that Madeline is driving a dark Aston Martin, even though it isn't the DBS from OHMSS. It's the 87 V8 Vantage from The Living Daylights, just to stick in the knife further to us diehard fans. But it was just too cutesy and dumb to just invert the ending and have the great love of Bond's life survive with his child, and Bond himself is dead. It's also, of course, inverting the sort of denouement of You Only Live Twice, the novel, where, of course, Bond never realizes that he has a child with Kissy Suzuki and survives, but has amnesia and thinks he's a Japanese fisherman for a while before. But even Fleming doesn't leave it there. Fleming leaves and closes the novel with, Bond going off to find himself, because he finds himself drawn, but not drawn back to London or back to Japan, but he finds himself drawn to various places in Russia for some reason, because that has a deep stirring with his within his mind that he's lost his memory. He knows it's important. And of course, that's a great, brilliant, suspenseful note to close the novel out on, that Bond will wind up going into what would be at the time in the Cold War, the lion's den, literally walk into the Soviet Union not knowing who he is. And that sets up the brilliant opening of Fleming's final novel, The Man with the Golden Gun, where Bond reappears after being presumed dead for some time, and of course has been brainwashed by the Soviets to assassinate M. That's a scene they allude to, at least Purvis and Wade alluded to in Die Another Day on board the ship when Bond comes to consciousness, and there's the sheet of glass between himself and M. That's what's in Fleming's novel in the opening of The Man with the Golden Gun. It's one of his best openings. And again, it's a great suspenseful note. It at least closes with something along with the emotional resonance, whereas No Time to Die doesn't have any of that. I do want, when you look at the Craig films, which I try to avoid them. I've seen them all, more than once now. I've seen each one in its original theatrical release, even though it felt like another piece of me was dying in front of my eyes. And I'm not saying that just to say that. I have always had that sort of knee-jerk reaction to these. But I do think No Time to Die is the worst of the Craig films, not just because it is disjointed, it doesn't fix any of the problems of Spectre, it just adds, extra character scenes and supposed emotional depth when there really isn't any. It's still the bare framework of perhaps a postmodern take on the structure of a James Bond film and trying to dissect it in the way that Christopher Nolan has done or did with the Dark Knight films. But I think it is the worst of the Craig films because it does the most damage to the legacy of the James Bond film series. It tries its hardest to be completely anti the traditional elements of the Bond film series, and I think it is because of that, and because it is so blatantly attempting to not be a James Bond film in a bad sense, and that it doesn't want to be a James Bond film. It's a James Bond film where nobody wants to be making a James Bond film. And that's seemingly been the stance that Eon has taken in this Craig era. And to push that point even further, we haven't had anything even resembling a traditional Bond film since Tomorrow Never Dies back in 1997. And even there, starting with the beginning of the Brosnan era and GoldenEye, there's been this whole undercurrent where the Bond has to prove himself, and it's all about analyzing Bond. The entire point of GoldenEye was to prove Bond was still relevant in 1995 in the post-Cold War period, and since the film series had not been on screens in 6 years. But the analysis of Bond worked in GoldenEye because it was necessary to reestablish Bond, establish a new actor, a new tenure, and to make up for the 6-year gap, which was the longest there had been at that time. What GoldenEye also did was to have a real strong sense of actual intelligence and espionage. I think that primarily was due to the writing talents of Jeffrey Kane, who was the second writer on the film, with the energy of Martin Campbell's direction, and everyone had something to prove, which is what GoldenEye did wonderfully. But it never let these elements overwhelm the fact that it was still supposed to be a James Bond film with adventure elements, a villain's plot that actually meant something, and in the telling of the story, you can allow Bond's character to come to surface and have moments of his more human side, which is something the films have always excelled in. Not that most critics are ever looking at the films that seriously, which is their fault because they should be. This is something that Fleming knew how to do beautifully in the novels, and I think the best of the films are able to do this with a sort of effortless grace that doesn't overwhelm the story being told and doesn't overwhelm the runtime, which is another gigantic problem with No Time to Die. It's 2 hour, 40-minute plus runtime is ridiculous. It is far too long. A James Bond film should run to about 2 hours. I think the runtime of No Time to Die would, if Peter Hunt were still with us, it would have him absolutely, it would have given him a stroke. OHMSS was the longest film for the longest time. It's 2 hour, 20-minute runtime, and that was because Peter Hunt insisted on it, fought for it, basically got it pushed through, but everything there was earned. There wasn't anything you could really cut from the film. They did eventually cut the sequence with Finian at the College of Arms and the train crash after the chase through London. We have all the great stills of George Lazenby running around, but that was really cut more for time, and they realized they didn't need it, and you get that great jump cut from, if he is a man, I'd like to get him out of Switzerland, bang. So that was a perfectly mined cut. But outside of that, there wasn't really any material you could cut. It was all vital. It was all important. It all told the story. Nothing dragged, and the pace never dragged. Whereas in this film, there are whole sequences that don't mean anything, particularly the Cuba sequence. But on the other hand, that is the most fun you have in the entire picture. You get the wonderful energy of the character of Paloma, played by Ana de Armas, who is unfortunately then gone from the rest of the film. And that whole sequence means nothing, except for the fact that at the end of it, there's the final bit on board the boat where we get the reveal of the double agent, and suddenly Felix Leiter is dead because gotta tie things up, I guess. His character has always been wasted in the film series, and he's sporadically appeared in the Craig era, and now he's gone. And then, of course, that was right after they killed off the entirety of the Spectre organization. The No Time to Die is a film that feels like nothing but a string of missed opportunities. And if you wanted to experiment with the formula, if you wanted to bring in more Fleming elements, they could have. And I think it was a missed opportunity. Again, I think that's the best way to summarize the entirety of the Craig era. If you wanted to experiment, they didn't do enough of Fleming elements. There's some bare elements, but this was the time where you could do things like have more Bond's internal monologue, have him get hideously injured, make the torture sequences more intensive like the novels. This is basically when you could have done Bond films much more like the Fleming novels and do the things that they couldn't do in the 60s or 70s, do the things that are outside the traditional cinematic Bond formula. I don't know if they're going to continue to experiment like this in, I guess, maybe the next sort of leg of Bond films, if they're going to continue in this. We're going to do a couple films with an actor and they're going to be their own separate universe, and then each time they recast, they're going to basically, start fresh and redo everything in another alternate universe. I realize I'm kind of rambling at this point. I didn't make any particular plans, but I just wanted to put something together to share my own personal, more general feelings. Of course, with spoilers, I wanted to give some time for people to be able to see the film and discuss it with other fans, but also to I needed time to actually process what I had seen, because it was 165 minutes of stuff. It ultimately has no resonance for me, and I'm never going to go back and rewatch it again or revisit it. I don't feel the need to. I got, I pretty much got everything the first time around anyway. I did rewatch the first 4 films of the Craig era in preparation for No Time to Die, which is something I don't really ever do. I forced myself and sat through all of them, and gave it a fair shot in my home theater. And doing it in chronological order is necessary to understand everything in No Time to Die, because without seeing those 4 films, this film is not going to really make a whole lot of sense. Not that it does anyway, but it does really show the ups and downs these films have had in terms of their effectiveness, how they've been produced in the cinematic landscape of their year of release, and also how they have met or not met public expectations. And you can see the individual strengths of each and the weaknesses of each film. But it did really make it clear for me that I think the perfect exit point for the Craig era would have probably been the end of Skyfall. That seems to be where they drew a sort of line in the sand, and it felt like, even though I have massive issues with that film as well, there is a sort of energy there, and it builds to its climax, and then it tries to exit on finally addressing the classic notes of Bond and M's office, bringing back the wood-paneled office, a little bit of the leather-padded door, Moneypenny at the desk, and then going into a gun barrel at the end, which still kills me. But at least it had some air of finality, and that felt like a send-off. These last 2 films, Spectre and No Time to Die, I just get, again, the notion of stuff happens. There's it's stuff that's just strung together. There's no air of finality, even though they freaking killed him off at the end of No Time to Die. You can't be much more final than that. But even the ending of that, with Madeline and Child driving off into the sunset, feels anticlimactic, whereas had they ended this era with Skyfall, I think it probably would have turned out much better. It also doesn't help that each film now takes so long to get off the ground, and the various legal hurdles that Eon has to go through, and now with the Amazon buyout, it remains unknown how that's going to affect the series. So really, actually getting one of the films off the ground has become 90% of the work, it seems, which is no one's fault really. And I always have to commend Eon for managing to even get a film made, and that's why I go every single time and buy my ticket and show my support, even though I know I'm going to be battered around for 2.5 hours, if not more, like this time. But it shouldn't be that way. What I hope happens in the future from this point forward, what I think needs to happen is we need to, for lack of a better term, there needs to be a get back to basics approach. Bond needs to fully embrace the identity of the cinematic Bond once again, because no one else can do that. There are many pretenders to the throne, and over the past few years, Eon has actually let the Mission Impossible series, once that reinvented itself with Ghost Protocol, really start to steal a lot of Bond's thunder in the cinematic lexicon. The Mission Impossible films are now doing what Bond should be doing in terms of the globe-trotting and the stunts and people talking about the stunts. Well, they talk about that with Mission Impossible. They're not talking about that with Bond. Bond is now moving into other films' territories. They are taking from and imitating other films far more than when earlier films are accused of doing that. Everybody always likes to say Man with the Golden Gun is ripping off kung fu films. Live and Let Die was ripping off the blaxploitation movement. Moonraker was inspired by Star Wars. All of those were influences. And in those three particular cases, those were distinct influences. But those films never lost sight of the fact they were James Bond films. James Bond was the central character, and they're still great films. That is something that the Craig films and the Craig era do not do. They don't keep a lock or a focus on the fact they are James Bond films. They seem perfectly happy to pull from and imitate and try to become something else instead of what they are. And again, you see the evidence and the success of the Mission Impossible films, their continued box office, and now they're starting to get much more on a tracked production cycle. They're shooting 2 of them at once right now, which is probably not a good idea, but at least they're generating more films in less time than it's taken to get just one more James Bond film. That is something that Bond used to be able to do, and if it's ever possible to get back to the a Bond film every 2 years, or probably 3 years is probably a better estimate now, with the way productions are and how much longer things take. But if there could be a return to some sort of regular scheduling where you knew a James Bond film would come every 2 to 3 years, and you knew it would be a quality experience that you could rely upon, that helps bring in the built-in audience. Sorry, I should say bring out the built-in audience. That's what built up the core Bond audience anyway all these years. And that would be my hope for the future. And that is something that the series has attempted and done before, particularly For Your Eyes Only is the standout example, where they tried to literally, quote, bring Bond back down to Earth after Moonraker. And that was a successful... It wasn't an experiment. It's still a great film, and I think that is something that's the direction to go in after this point. You've gone as far as you can with this particular. Do whatever you want, make it more of an art film. Riff on all these things going on now that aren't Bond. If you go any further with that, you're basically not making a Bond film at all. I would argue No Time to Die is not a James Bond film. It really isn't. But this is the point in time where you have to go back to the tried and true. You have to make people interested again. And I think the best way to do that would be to fully embrace the identity of what a James Bond film is. Go back, tell films with great stories that are gripping and exciting. Do what no one else can. Have the high gloss, the high lifestyle of the James Bond films that was so enticing to the original audiences of the 1960s, but also double down on those qualities. Make sure every dollar is on the screen, which they still do, even though the budgets have gotten increasingly larger. but also do things that are, a bit dangerous, a bit risky in terms of not, oh, we're just going to go completely two sheets to the wind and do things that are anti-Bond formula, but do things that are risky, like actually make the films without any usage of CGI whatsoever. Make them the old-fashioned way, if you want to use that term. Bond films used to be known and prided for their stunts and their practical effects work. And, the last time there was a completely all analog James Bond film was License to Kill. What would it be like in the 2021 landscape if the next James Bond film came out and was completely done reel for reel, was shot on film, was edited on film, which hasn't been done since GoldenEye, and I think makes a key distinction, a key difference. You could beat Mission Impossible at its own game, which has literally been how many elements can we steal from Bond without getting caught. And I like things in those films. It's not to pick at them, because they're doing what anybody would naturally do. If James Bond isn't going to do James Bond elements, well, somebody else is going to come in and start doing that. But if Bond could come back and do the classic elements and show that there is no equal, to quote the amazing tagline for GoldenEye, there is no substitute. That's what the next James Bond film needs to do. That's what every James Bond film needs to do, to prove that there is no substitute for the James Bond films, which is the greatest series of escapism and entertainment that the motion picture medium has ever known or will ever know. And I say all this as a lifelong Bond fan and a nerd and, somebody who can't go 2 seconds of any day without thinking of something Bond related. So, in summary, I would like to say that now is the time for the James Bond films to pick up the phone and order breakfast for one at 9, please. Green figs, yogurt, coffee, very black. Instead of what we've been getting, which is more along the lines of Siamese vodka. So, to No Time to Die, I would just like to say one word that I think summarizes my entire experience and is the final send-off I give to the picture, which is simply foo yuck. Welcome to the second part of this video. Again, I'm just a goofy Bond nerd, and I'm just going to give you my sort of spitball ramblings of, if I had to tackle the No Time to Die storyline, this would be like my own particular sort of spitballing I would do in a pitch meeting. Again, this is all general ideas, so make of it what you will. You could play around with any of these and, make it more akin to what happened in the film, or just tack it on, or use this to take some of the film plot lines and take it into a different direction. Essentially, what I feel is the film could be made much better and much more Bondian, to use that term, if instead of just making little nods and taking bits of Fleming's You Only Live Twice novel, what they should have done, and what could have been a great experiment and a beautiful way to give a send-off for the Craig era, because of course there is an era finality in the original story, is to make the film much more of a closer adaptation of Fleming's You Only Live Twice novel. That is, I think, what the film misses out on. I feel if you adhered more closely to, not beat for beat its structure, but if it had more of the tonality and more of the feeling of the Only Live Twice novel, I think it could be much more of a proper James Bond story, because You Only Live Twice is the most atypical of Fleming's novels. It is the most unlike any Bond story, and that's why, of course, they never made it into a film in 1967, instead getting Roald Dahl to write the final screenplay for that film. So that was my jumping off point. Again, I started thinking of some of this stuff while I was literally watching the film in the theater for the first time. And I've had some time to ruminate a little bit and see that some of my ideas were maybe a little bit too off the wall, or a little bit too goofy, or a bit too much, but I just wanted to put this together to at least get some of this out, and maybe get some response, or see how this may resonate with some other people. So again, this is a very rough thing. I'm just going to sort of go through in sort of bullet point fashion, and just essentially give my own approach. Maybe look at this as like a creative writing prompt where you have a story and it ends a certain way, and the prompt is write another 6 pages or write a new ending, or how would you have approached this same material. So with sticking with the core of the No Time to Die plot and the way the film told it, this would be how I would have approached the same material to try to give it more of a Fleming basis and more of the James Bond character, and made it resonate and actually have an air of finality and give a sort of send-off for this era of the Daniel Craig James Bond films. So in essence, to start, I would, for my first point, the pre-title sequence would be basically involve seemingly things going wrong and Madeline being supposedly killed, whether it be an explosion or whatever device you would like to use. And then, of course, the pre-title sequence would end with it being revealed that it was all being done by Blofeld, who had escaped his prison by that point. And so the final moments of the pre-title sequence would be this realization coming to Bond and the beginnings of his intensive guilt that it's his fault. He couldn't protect Madeline. It is his fault that he didn't kill Blofeld at the end of Spectre. Now Blofeld has, dealt him another death card, another fatal blow, and gotten away. So it is the ultimate crushing defeat and the beginnings of the guilt that will possibly destroy Bond. And then immediately you go into the title sequence. So already you have much greater stakes and you have much greater emotional depth, and you're already building elements that will mean that but the eventual meeting between Bond and Blofeld will actually mean something. So that would be my first point. And again, you can work this any way you like. This is much more of a general sort of pitch meeting, how I'm approaching the same material. Then you come out of the pre-title sequence, and you still probably do the sort of time gap, moving forward ahead in time a bit, which comes right out of GoldenEye, coming 9 years later after the title sequence. But basically, you would then move into Bond sort of moving through his daily life and being sort of a wreck, but not wanting to admit it and things. This is much more the feeling of Bond through the majority of You Only Live Twice, which of course takes place after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where he is emotionally destroyed after the murder of Tracy by Blofeld, who of course gets away. So that, I think, is a much better way of referencing On Her Majesty's Secret Service and doing something the films never really did, because, of course, previously all we had was the opening of Diamonds Are Forever and the reference to Bond getting his revenge on Blofeld and then trying to tiptoe around the perceived failure of the film OHMSS. So I would say add that factor in there, and then you have essentially the culmination of that where it's another mission that goes horribly wrong, and you could actually probably make that the Cuba sequence, and it essentially results in Felix Leiter's death, which Bond feels again responsible for, and Felix literally dies in his arms, as happens in the film. But that would add greater resonance, and then Felix's final words for Bond to continue on, to not take it personally, and to use that as fuel for his own internal fire to keep going, and Bond forcing himself to eventually start to do some of that. But he's even more of an emotional wreck now, and his guilt factor has increased all the more, and Felix's death will then actually mean something. And again, have it be down to because of Bond's internal strife and struggles that he missed something, or he feels he missed something that causes Felix's death. So it's happened again, and setting up this continuing idea, the prevailing sense that death is always around Bond and death is the only constant companion, which is something Fleming would always allude to, and of course is the perfect companion to an assassin. Next, I would keep the MacGuffin of the DNA genetic virus. I thought that was really an interesting idea. Like all the Craig films usually have an interesting plot hook or idea or MacGuffin, but just sort of waste them. So I would definitely keep that, and I would use that as the impetus to get Bond sent to Japan, whereas in the novel, it's all about trying to get the Japanese SIS to agree to, or should say the Japanese government, to agree to let the British have access to a cipher decoding machine. And it's basically Bond sent on a goodwill mission that's more diplomatic and less action oriented, and it's not a 00 mission, and it's also meant as a last ditch. This is how you save your career, you wreck of a man. It's also humiliation, and Bond knows this, and it just furthers his own grief and tension and anxiety. And I think you could really do something with that in the film, but you could keep the DNA virus as the sort of MacGuffin, but essentially use that as the way you get Bond to Japan, and I would say relocate the rest of the story to Japan, which, the end of the film kind of does already anyway, because Safin's base is the island somewhere off of Japan. Next, I would also keep the bit of Fleming from the novel that I've always really enjoyed, and that is Bond as the foreigner in Japan, the notion of the gaijin, as they say in Japan, that really mirroring his own internal alienation from not just MI6, but the rest of the world, because he feels more of an outsider than he's ever felt in his life, and he's a complete wreck. So the notion of the foreigner or the Englishman in Japan, not only does he stick out physically because of physical accoutrements, but also culturally, and so having to acclimatize himself to that as sort of a nice mirroring of his own internal struggle that's going on at this time. I would also keep the character of Nomi, but this time, instead of it literally being, oh, this is your replacement and, she's going to be better than you in any way, I would instead have her take the role of the Dicko Henderson character, who is the, MI6 man in Tokyo, who has opinions on everything and has a completely different background and is certainly not a typical Japanese man. I think it would have been more interesting to have the Nomi character be like that, and you could have the pushback they wanted, somebody to push back against Bond's character and him being sort of over the hill and things like that, without it being so cliched as your work replacement, like the newer, better model. And eventually you could have the same thing where she comes to sort of understand not only Bond's charms, but his own strengths and the things that only he can do, that even if they are not necessarily by the MI6 playbook. Next, I would have the Safin character wind up to just be a front, if you will. He's almost the Osato of this film's story, to reference back to the original You Only Live Twice film adaptation. Or if you want, just revealed to be the villain's henchman, like Renard and The World Is Not Enough. This means that you would keep the bit of Tiger Tanaka in the novel asking Bond to check out the castle of Dr. Shatterhand, this mysterious character with the Garden of Death that he, lures all kinds of suicidal Japanese people to, simply come and kill themselves. And of course, in doing this, he gives Bond a picture of Dr. Shatterhand. Bond sees it is actually Blofeld, says nothing, and decides to go anyway because now he can get his revenge. Because, of course, of all coincidences, that's where Blofeld has relocated to, and now Bond has a fix on him, and that starts to boil the water of the kettle of suspense, if you will. It starts those wheels in motion, which is something that this story would really, really need. So I would keep that, which gets us to the finale and the location with the Garden of Death from Fleming's novel. So, of course, the real villain of the piece will be Blofeld, who reappears as Dr. Shatterhand, and Bond knows this and infiltrates the Garden of Death. So once you do a similar sequence to what we have in the novel, building the tension and the suspense, and Bond moving through this amazing locale where practically anything he comes into contact with him will kill him in horrible, violent manners, he is finally caught by giving himself away because he sees what looks like a ghost. He sees what looks like Madeline somehow walking around. And of course, this is where things now go into a pretty dark territory. I know some people say, oh, well, these films are dark. It's like, well, no, not really. Like, if you want to see dark, here you go. So my sort of approach on this material is Madeline was not obviously killed in the beginning, and as a final sort of revenge, a more personal revenge on Bond, Blofeld has kept Madeline hostage all these years, or all this time period, and essentially, eventually, with the aid of the various elements of the Garden of Death, broke her not only spiritually but also mentally. And so now she is no longer the person that Bond was so head over heels in love with, but to finally answer the sort of fan theory questions we've always wondered about this Madeline character. Oh, is she's supposed to be Tracy from OHMSS? Is she actually supposed to be Tiffany Case from Diamonds Are Forever, the novel? Well, what if, and the ultimate twist of twist, if you will, what if Blofeld was the villain and Madeline inadvertently became the Irma Bunt of the scenario? And when her mind snapped, she became devoted to Blofeld and his causes, and hates Bond's mere existence, and is a shadow of her former self, and the horror that Bond would encounter at finding this scenario. It is perhaps one of the greatest revenge Blofeld could have on Bond. He thought she was dead all these years. Now he finds that she isn't. And because, again, of his own failures, she has become completely lost to him and is still alive and well. And worst of all, completely devoted to his greatest enemy. That is probably a point at which I'm probably borrowing a bit from the Great Return of the Joker and what Joker winds up doing with the Tim Drake character. If you know that great animated film, it's still a great plot idea. Other things have done similar things, but that's probably the inspiration for that sort of idea. And then to take it even a little bit further, if that wasn't quite dark enough, if we want to keep the notion of Madeline giving birth to Bond's child, well, what if she was able to do that and did so while under the captivity of Blofeld's designs on her? And so essentially Bond's child has been raised as Blofeld's child, to just twist that knife even further. And then you could have some really horrifying moments where you see this small child who likes to just simply walk around the Garden of Death, which is something they allude to, they hint at, they have a little touch of in the film, but that is such an underwhelming Garden of Death, and they don't do it. Just imagine how much of an image that would be to see a small child walking through. Ultimately, it would be part of Blofeld's mad scheme for revenge on Bond, that he has not only the adoration but control over Bond's love, potential wife, and child. There are shades here of the 1934 The Black Cat, the classic horror film, and what the Karloff character of Polzig does to the Lugosi character of Wiedergast. Ultimately, Blofeld has gone mad by this point, as he essentially does in the novel as well, for all the times that Bond has foiled him, and in the process of his mad scheme, has developed the DNA virus that we're keeping from the primary film, and just basically wants revenge on the world. He's not content to simply be the catalyst for deaths of suicidal Japanese people, but he wants to essentially erase parts of humanity at large. And he could work into it that he utilized some of the working elements of the Garden of Death in the formulation of the DNA virus. So there are, maybe a little bit of shades there of Dracula's plot against the world and humanity with his plague in Satanic Rites of Dracula, if we want to keep drawing parallels. But also, a little bit of, Drax and Moonraker by using the natural poison of the flower to actually turn into his toxin to kill humanity, and his sort of destroy the world plot. So basically, Bond is confronted by all of this, the ultimate horrors and the ultimate defeats, and has no real way to stop Blofeld other than knowing that he has to. And of course, in the process, we'll have to figure out what to do about Madeline and his child. So it becomes a matter of Bond having to overcome his internal demons and persevere, as he does in the novel. And it's an internal journey, just as it is getting at least some action into the climax. And of course, it would have to end in a similar way. Eventually, everything would be destroyed. If you want to locate the castle on top of the volcanic area and have the gases from the geyser be the catalyst as it is in the novel, or something different, it doesn't really matter how you get to that point. But essentially, Bond fights to the death and ensures the explosion of the complex and the destruction of the manufacturer of the genetic virus. And it gets us to the point where he will have the final battle with Blofeld, a gnarly, nasty, to the death hand battle where Bond is in over his head and is outnumbered as he is in the novel. In the process, it would be really great if he has to eventually fight Madeline, who throws herself into the mix as the sort of Irma Bunt of the scenario. And in the process, it would be really fitting if he is indeed infected by a specially made DNA virus that Blofeld devised simply to target Madeline and her child. So Bond simply coming into contact with them does ensure their own death. It proves that Blofeld doesn't care anything about Madeline. She is merely a puppet or tool of his own insane desires, and she dies fighting her former beloved. I just felt that was a really poetic way to do it. And furthering this idea that Blofeld, you can even have Blofeld comment on it, that everything Bond touches just, I don't know if you'd go the full Mr. Wint route, but everything, he touches just seems to die. Then again, going to the title, No Time to Die, and this continual theme I started setting up at the beginning of the film, that, again, Bond's only true constant companion is death. He feels he caused the death of Madeline in the opening. He feels he caused the death of Felix Leiter. He feels almost dead inside himself. His internal malaise for his job and his lifestyle and his work is at its greatest point. His self-doubt is at his greatest point. And now, when he finds out that Madeline is still alive, he causes her to die anyway, even though, maybe spiritually she was no longer the same person, so she would have died already by that point in more esoteric terms, but also the death of his own child by his own hand, of course unintentionally, but sort of the greatest, most direct part of Blofeld's revenge, which of course pushes Bond into the absolute frenzied moment as we get at the climax of the fight in the novel. We finally get to see that in cinematic, in film form, as the whole place is about to explode at any moment. Again, building up that tension factor, not giving a lot of time for things to play out further. And finally, Bond is able to just barely manage to, tear the life from Blofeld. And we finally get the die, Blofeld, die line that was used and so casually thrown away in the film version that it took me a second to even realize that's what he said in the film when that line is used, which is the line from the novel. But having it in its proper context and the full-on emotional usage as the line is intended, I think would give a really great dramatic impact and give a great end to Blofeld finally on screen, where he is, as M would say in Diamonds Are Forever, dead, finished. And of course, that's when the explosion goes off, and Bond is able to crash through the window dramatically, and then we go to the obituary where he is presumed dead by MI6, closing out in a similar manner to the novel. But I don't know if I probably wouldn't keep the whole business with Kissy Suzuki, and I don't know if by that point in time on the runtime, if it would be a good idea to keep the amnesia aspects and things. I mean, I guess you really could if you wanted to, but this isn't really. It's an adaptation of You Only Live Twice, the novel. It's using more of the elements, but it's not a direct blow for blow or beat for beat adaptation. So that's how I would build up to that climax, and then for the actual ending, once that is read and we get the lines from Fleming and the obituary and M having to give it and things, which they do a version of that in the film. What I would do is cut back to Japan. The final scene would be completely wordless. You would have a beatific area. You would have the blooming cherry blossom trees and the blossoms starting to fall as they fall off the decaying tree branches. But as this beautiful, beatific landscape is going, you realize that what you're actually looking at is a small graveyard. And then in the distance, there is a dark, shadowy figure standing in front of two small, white, unmarked tombstones or graves. And he places, a single rose on each. And you see the figure whose eyes are hidden by dark sunglasses, who is, a mass of bruises and such. You realize that it was, of course, Bond who did not die, and then he just disappears into the back of the shot, and all you see are the falling, decaying leaves or blossoms of the cherry blossoms. It's a total nod to For Your Eyes Only, of course, and it's also primarily a total nod to the ending of The Third Man, which is one of the great influences on James Bond. But that's where I would end the film. And of course, you get the iconic James Bond will return credit over the graves with the rose on each. Because of course there would be a grave for both his wife and child, even though there is no body to bury. He still, had made a small unmarked marker for each, and of course the added irony is that there's not even anything to bury, that it's just a plot with nothing there, if only for his memory. Something to commemorate them, or the life that they and he in turn would have had. And that, of course, is the only way you really could end that type of story, because James Bond is not somebody who could have that life or ever be satisfied with that life. As Fleming would say in the ending lines of the Man with the Golden Gun novel, that sort of view would always pall. And to say anything differently, that Bond could have any other companion other than death itself, that anyone could survive his orbit without dying themselves, to say anything other than that would be of as little consequence as Sparrow's Tears, which is the way Fleming ends You Only Live Twice, the novel. And of course, this is all very simple. It is a very downer note. It's completely dialogue free, but I think that would be a much better and much more effective closing of that story. And you don't have any cop-outs, and you manage to also succinctly, get rid of the other characters, because you can't have a James Bond film with him having a wife and kid back home. It doesn't work that way. So, anytime there's a more serious relationship, it's not like you already know those people are probably not long for this world, simply because the way the story goes. If they're more serious and they're meant to stick around for a while, well, you either know they're going to, be turncoat, or they're going to get killed off. It's just how this thing works. So all in all, this is just a sort of rough spitballing, and it's probably what I would have pitched if I was presented with the same sort of story structure. These are all general ideas. These could all be fleshed out further. You could work them closer into the No Time to Die storyline, or you could use it as more of a departure and sort of take off on another pathway if you can. But that's how I would approach it. If, again, this is like a creative writing prompt, how would you tackle this material? Of course, I would have written something different had there been, a different sort of story setup. This was just my own sort of internal headcanon, trying to make something at least a little bit more Bondian out of No Time to Die, or trying to make it a little bit more Fleming-esque in some way, shape, or fashion. But ultimately, I am glad this era is over, and we can move forward now, hopefully, into something that at least is more Bondian in its content and feel and style. Again, with the Amazon buyout of MGM, it remains to be seen how that's going to affect Eon and the James Bond films. It's definitely going to affect in some way. It just remains to be seen how things are going to go, whether they will, try and force their hand in influencing the films, or their marketing, or how this will affect the original films and their 4K releases. Also, it remains to be seen if we're going to ever get back to a traditional style James Bond film, or anything in the original continuity of the original 20 films, or if this is going to mean, again, as I alluded to before, that with each recasting of the lead actor, that perhaps we're going to have a new sort of alternate universe for this particular decade or era, and it becomes its own particular section of the overall James Bond lore, if that's the sort of type of cycle that Eon is going to try and continue along with. It's just all up in the air at this point. So again, this has been my personal musings and what ifs in regards to No Time to Die, which is an experience that I am glad I have had and is over, and now I don't have to bother with it anymore. I don't ever have to come back to it again. It is over and done with and finished. So, thank you ever so much for watching. Hopefully, this has allowed you to process some of your own further feelings for No Time to Die and the state of James Bond here in 2021, where you might think things could go from here. It all remains to be seen. So, again, I hope this has helped in some way, shape, or fashion. I found it helpful simply trying to process what I sat through and what story the film told and how the Craig era has finally ended. So I do think the film will have some reappraisals over time, as everything does. But I definitely think that negativity factor is already very much present in there. I just don't know if many people are able to explain it as clearly. I've tried to make my feelings clearer, but unfortunately, it always starts to turn into somewhat of a ramble. So hopefully you got something out of this, and hopefully it hasn't been too much of a ramble. But I just had to finally get something out there, and hopefully maybe you like some of the ideas I came up with. Again, it's my own sort of spitball pitch meeting approach to how would I try and fix the No Time to Die storyline and try and at least make it a little more Bondian and give some sort of send off for the end of this particular tenure. But with all that said, thank you ever so much for watching. Keep flying the James Bond flag. Keep keep the British end up. And to once again, I say to No Time to Die, simply foo yuck.